Hi AMP1 students. In this video we are going to talk about tetanus and botulism. And since we already understand the anatomy and physiology of skeletal muscle cells, then we can understand how tetanus and botulism can lead to abnormal skeletal muscle functioning. Okay, so there are little boxes that talk about this information. I think it's at the very bottom here. Yep. So this is the box that talks about tetanus and botulism. So I'm going to talk about this at the using the picture, but this is where you can find some of the information that you need to know about these two diseases. So we're going to go back up to our picture because this is where it happens. Okay, so for tetanus, so the thing that you need to know about tetanus is that it's caused by a bacteria. And generally that's a bacteria that you pick up from the soil. So you probably have heard people say if you got like, if you were outside and like maybe you stepped on a nail, a rusty nail or something, they'll say, oh, you should go get a tetanus shot. And that's true because the soil contains these bacteria, and if you have some sort of puncture wound, these bacteria love areas that don't have as much oxygen. So, so a puncture wound, you can any bacteria that get into that puncture wound and then it kind of closes over can make the perfect breeding ground for these bacterial organisms. Now, it's mainly those bacterial organisms that grow, but what they release that is actually going to affect skeletal muscles functioning is they release a toxin. They call it a neurotoxin because it actually affects the motor neuron of the body. And so what that toxin will do, remember this is our kind of the end of our motor neuron, the axon, and then the axon terminal. So what happens with the tetanus condition, the bacteria will cause the neuron to send too many action potentials. And so it will continue to stimulate this neuron, motor neuron, to send an action potential, send an action potential, send an action potential, like one after the other. And so what that does is causes acetylcholine to be released all the time and bind to the acetylcholine receptors. And then if we're getting an action potential here all the time, then we're getting the action potential communicated over to the sarcolemma of our skeletal muscle cell or fiber. And then we'll get contraction and pretty much a sustained contraction of the skeletal muscle cell. And so, so you'll get this spasticity. So kind of like the muscles are spasming, they can't stop contracting, and they'll call it spastic paralysis because you can't move the way you want to, so that's paralysis, but it's actually when the reason you can't move is because the muscles are contracting and they won't stop contracting. So I'm going to show you kind of the, because they don't have a picture in the book, but a lot of times people maybe have seen these pictures. So this is showing in stages of tetanus. Before we knew how to treat it, people would have all their muscles contracting and it would put them into a particular position that they couldn't get out of. So they called that spastic paralysis. So pretty scary condition. So that's why we get a tetanus shot vaccine. We call it a tetanus shot, but it's a vaccine that will protect us if we get those tetanus organisms. If we would come in contact with them, it would neutralize those toxins before they actually were able to affect our neurons, motor neurons. So, and it usually, that immunity usually lasts about 10 years, I think is on average. So you should keep your tetanus vaccine up to date for that reason. So that is how tetanus works in the human body. And again, it's summarized here in our objectives too. Then botulism, it's also a bacteria, but normally we're going to get that from eating food that's contaminated, and a lot of times poorly preserved canned food seems to be like one of the main ways people can ingest this bacteria that causes botulism. So these two have a similarity as far as it's the toxin that the bacteria produce that's going to cause a problem with the skeletal muscle functioning. So in our picture here, botulism, or the toxin, the botulism, the bacteria that cause botulism, what they do is they affect the motor neuron, but they affect it here at these synaptic vesicles. So what the toxin that causes botulism does is prevents the release of sufficient amounts of acetylcholine at the axon terminal or into the synapse here. So if we don't have proper or sufficient amount of acetylcholine being released here, we're not going to have sufficient stimulation of the acetylcholine receptors, and we'll very likely not get very many action potentials running along the sarcolemma or skeletal muscle fiber to cause muscle contraction. So botulism causes paralysis as well. Skeletal muscles don't function properly and we can't move, but it's more they're relaxed and we can't get them to contract. And that's again because we don't have that acetylcholine or not sufficient amounts of it being released from the axon terminal. So that's the cause of botulism, is the bacteria's toxin is preventing acetylcholine to be released from the axon terminal. So we don't get stimulation or excitement of the skeletal muscle fiber, so we don't get contraction. So they call that flaccid paralysis, which people usually think more of flaccid paralysis when someone says paralysis. But that's that condition where the muscles are relaxed and there's no way to get them to contract. So they call that flaccid paralysis. All right, so that is our information about the tetanus and botulism. In the next video, we'll start talking about the rest of our objectives here. And we'll get into all the different types of muscle fiber cells that we have in the body. And we'll talk about muscle tone and how motor units work and those exciting little bits of information. So I'll see you in the next video.